Hello and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. You are watching Debate Night. Tonight I am going to be debating Warren Harding-Stan, and we're going to be debating, that's Grayson right here, we're going to be debating, as far as I recall, what you mentioned you wanted to take up as an issue of debate was namely neoconservatism and domestic policy and the efficacy of domestic policy. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I
Okay.
would argue that. We're not done yet with that. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say. So with that said, we don't have a moderator tonight, but these debates are usually pretty polite and cordial. So hopefully we won't need one. As usual, the challenger Grayson here will get 3 minutes to make an opening statement. Then I'll have 3 minutes to make my opening statement. Then we'll get into the actual substance of the debate. And then when we go to closing statements after between 75 and 90 minutes of actual debate content, I'll go first for my closing remarks, and then Grayson will give his closing remarks and close out because he's the one starting with the opening statement. So with that, before we actually get into the formal sort of debate portion, if you could kind of just introduce yourself to the audience and where they can find you, and maybe just like a general sort of brief overview of your political convictions, I think a lot of people would appreciate that.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for having me on, and I guess I'll start by mentioning the sort of fact of how I feel about neoconservatism is that I think it's been an ideology that has in the 80s and 90s did its job. It destroyed the Soviet Union. It got us out of the era of the stagflation. And so I would call it a success. However, I would have argued that for the next 20 years that it hasn't worked as much in the past. You've seen issues with the Iraq War and its controversies, and you've seen the issues of the 2008 recession, which I believe was the quote killer of neoconservatism because a neoconservative presidential candidate hasn't been able to win since. And when you saw the rise of Donald Trump, that was sort of the reaction to the failure of neoconservatism. Now, I wouldn't say that Donald Trump has been the most elegant paleocon. He has certainly had his controversies from his life of just being a sort of bold figure, but he thinks, and up until recently, I would have said I probably would have supported him, not anymore, due to this whole policies, due to the whole DC storming thing. And I think that paleoconservatism definitely needs its improvements too. But I would just have argued that paleoconservatism, even though it is technically the old right and neoconservatism is a new right, paleoconservatism is more of a future when you look at the folks who were in Michigan who voted for Trump, who originally were voting for Obama and Kerry, the people in Minnesota in 2016 who voted for Trump, who voted for Kerry and Romney and Obama. And the fact that we are in the new realignment where we have states like Ohio no longer the swing states, or Iowa's no longer a swing state. This new swing states are states like Georgia and Arizona, which were states that were lost to the sort of Trump effect. But there are many issues on why we lost that, and maybe we can get into them later in this debate. And with that, I yield my time.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for keeping it under 3 minutes. I appreciate that. And so I'll go into my sort of 3 minute opening statements here. And because we don't have a moderator, things will be a little more free form than they might otherwise be. But essentially, here's sort of my take on this, which is that what I got to say is that I appreciate how Grayson did point out that, hey, look, neocons objectively had wins in the 80s. And so that's a good starting place where we can have some common ground there, because a lot of the people that I will argue against or debate against that happen to be on the right but take on either a counter neocon approach or a skeptical to neocon approach they'll often dismiss any sort of successes by neoconservatism when it's very clear that neoconservatism was the movement that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. And I think that everybody can recognize that. And so as a point of common ground, that's really good. In terms of getting into the more recent political climate, however, I would say that it's unfair to say that in the last 20 years, neocons haven't also had wins. I would characterize the Iraq War as a definitive success. I would also point out that the intervention in Afghanistan as well and the repelling of the Taliban was another more or less triumph for neoconservatives and vindicated in a proactive foreign policy approach. And it was ultimately where failures and hardships did emerge in these endeavors, it was due to the Obama administration and their fecklessness on foreign policy and their basically gutting of the teeth of the military presence on the ground, and especially in the case of pulling out of Iraq, that really solidified this tarnished legacy that we see, where people can say, "Oh, well, ISIS came in; that's the neocons' fault." When in reality, no, that was the Democrats. That was Barack Obama. But as far as the 2008 crisis that was mentioned, Grayson had mentioned that there is some legitimate criticism that we can get into here of politicians that had surrounded themselves with neocons, where their economic approach had been, I might characterize myself as too laissez-faire. And I would argue on the point, and I think I've got about just a minute or so left, on the point about how when we talk about the future in terms of right of center politics, I think it's been clear with recent trends that essentially that if this Trump brand, this populist brand might be the future of the right wing, then the future of America would definitively be democratic. And I think that a neoconservative renaissance going forward that's going to be popular and victorious must, as my friend Net7 and I would agree, and Wyatt as well, we would agree on this, has to have a more protectionist stance with respect to industry and workers at large when it comes to our economy for security reasons, as well as to rebirth our economic engine. So that's basically my statement there. So that's about the 3 minutes there. So we can go to Grayson then to get into the actual debate now. So yeah, you can lead the conversation from following on that.
Well, I would just argue that the Iraq War, it did achieve its goals. It did get rid of Saddam Hussein, which would be counted as a win. But there was this perception in the American media, and even if it is true or not, it's that the Iraq War was based off of a lie. I mean, you may disagree with that, but that's the perception, at least. I mean, we didn't find nearly this sort of weapons that we were told were there weren't necessarily there, and we have some controversies with Dick Cheney and Halliburton, where it just looked like he was enriching himself. So even if that isn't the true, purely optics, it didn't help the neoconservative movement. The issue I would also point out is that if you say that Trumpian populism, if that's the future of the right, then the future of America is Democrat. I would agree with you to a point that Trumpism is the problem, not necessarily the protectionist sort of populist movement that he is. You see, Trump, I will say, as a foremost supporter until recent events, I would say that as of now, he is not the candidate that they should be going for. Neither should people like Josh Hawley because of the controversies. I think ultimately the populist Republican future would be in more moderates like Pete Stabile, Brian Fitzpatrick, Fred Upton to a certain degree. And I mean, and I don't exactly think that a neoconservative renaissance is just likely to happen. I just don't see the American people being energized to fight another war I think that we should instead focus on more methods that might actually be more popular to fight nations, like economics against China, and like pumping oil into Europe so that we can counter the Russians. Those are situations that would we get into the protectionist neoconservatism would actually be more popular than necessarily troops on the ground.
Right. So a couple points there. The first one about the Iraq War. I would reject any characterizations that the Iraq War was ultimately based on a lie, because the claim by the Bush administration and explained by Colin Powell essentially was that the Iraqi state under Saddam Hussein had amassed weapons of mass destruction and posed a security threat. Now, the Iraqi state, taking any sort of moral or humanitarian interventionist arguments out of the equation, simply looking at the claim as it related to the security issue, it was clear Iraq was a menace that had invaded two countries, Iran and Kuwait, as well as had fired Scud missiles at Israel in the past, had nuclear weapons aspirations, conducted enriching of uranium at the Osirak reactor. And it wasn't until the Israelis had removed that reactor by force in an aerial raid that Saddam was rendered impotent in terms of his nuclear capability. That left him with a chemical stockpile. That chemical stockpile that he possessed in and of itself was unacceptable. However, he went above and beyond what could be considered as unacceptable, and that it was a menace. It was a violation of treaties for him to possess it in the first place. But what's infinitely worse than possession was that he used it against his own people and gassed 5,000 to 10,000 Kurds in the Anfal campaign. Additionally, by the time that 2003 and the invasion actually was conducted underway, again, my main criticism of the Iraq War is that it wasn't conducted following the Kuwait repelling of his forces. It should have happened under George H.W. Bush, but it didn't. In 2003, they had found weapons of mass destruction, specifically chemical weapons and the precursors to reamass a large stockpile on the ground there. And so you could say, well, was it exaggerated or whatnot? There's some conversation to be had there, but I would point out on my end of things, which is that the problem wasn't necessarily that the Bush administration had to, I guess, overstate or overhype the extent to which Saddam Hussein was a threat. The problem was essentially the leftist media, anti-war media that was incredibly anti-war, and they remain so to this day. You see that from people like Bill Maher, Rachel Maddow, etc. They're all they were never for it. They never had an open mind to it, and they really soured and poisoned the well in terms of the mind of the population towards it. And so if you have to stretch things in order to counter that, the administration did what they had to do. So that's my stance on that there. As it relates to the issue of China and Russia, I think on that we more or less would probably agree. I think we need to end the trading relationship with China. And on Russia, I would love to see America and Canada be the new energy source for Europe and just drill as much oil as possible and export it, even if we're losing money, over to Europe so that we can bankrupt Russia. That would be my stance there. But if you got any follow-up on that, feel free.
I don't really have much of a follow-up other than that, yeah, we probably should, and maybe Europeans should not be so hesitant to use nuclear energy. I mean, we literally talked about this just a few minutes ago, that the Green Party of Germany literally just shut down the nuclear plants, and now the two main sources of power in Germany are now coal and Russian gas. So I don't think the objective worked in Germany.
Yeah, no, Germany in particular, I think you and I would probably agree on this, that the German government itself is profusely weak, and that they are essentially in bed with the oligarchs in Moscow, right? Like, because they've undermined their own energy independence in a way that is disgraceful. I mean, if people tried that in Canada or the United States, my hope would be that we would see an absolute rejection of them in the next election. Whereas in Germany, it's a lot harder to wage a fair campaign against the establishment over there because they have such vast moneyed interest in Russia, and it becomes very difficult to really deal with that. I would say that an example of a way that you could fight Russia in a country that's been doing their best to counter Russia is Poland, and I would say that of all the EU countries, I'm most impressed by them in their rejection of Putin's imperial ambitions. But what would you make of that, Grayson?
Oh yes, well, I mean, definitely, if Russia's ever threatening Europe, Poland's going to be the thing that stops them. They have stopped, or at least attempted to stop Russia multiple times in the past. And the main thing is that the German government has just been historically weak ever since the last time the government was really strong and they ended up invading Europe. I think there is a bit of a feel that if the government gets too strong that they might somehow go back to that. I don't believe it personally. I think the German government should embrace certain patriotic symbols again. They shouldn't be afraid to embrace their nation without necessarily that part of the nation. But I mean, the closest thing we actually got to a strong German leader since the 1940s would be Helmut Kohl, the chancellor who fought to unify Germany. He was a sort of a political strongman, but since then, it just hasn't been a success state. It's always been trying to not do its own foreign policy without the EU, and it's been too weak to stand up to everyone. And anytime someone does, they just accuse them of doing the Holocaust. Like when a German politician accused China, they played the Holocaust card, which is ironic for China, given what they're doing.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I think I think as it relates to the EU, that's another big part of why it's so difficult to get Germany to behave properly, which is that they have the EU backing them up and they're a big patron of the European Union. What would be kind of, I guess we're a little bit getting away from the subject of the debate, but what would be your stance on the EU? Because I personally would like to see the EU dissolved and America dominate Europe, but what's your stance on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think Europe should be afraid to embrace independent from American foreign policy, but I also think that Europe should also not be too independent, if that makes sense. Like, I think Europe should be not afraid to stand up to the Russians. They shouldn't be afraid to stand up to the Chinese instead of just letting China's business come all over them. And they shouldn't be afraid to stand up to the Iranians. I mean, you know what they're like. It's like they're concerned every time Iran does something. Ironically enough, other than Poland, the only other nation to stand up to Iran is the nation that has a leader that stands for Russia. It's
right. I think the European Union, with respect to Iran, is with the enemy. Like I've said it before, with allies like the European Union, who needs enemies? When Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was assassinated by the Mossad, the European Union expressed deep concern over Fakhrizadeh's human rights being violated because Assad took him out because he was trying to get nukes for the Iranian state. So the European Union as an entity is clearly on the side of China and Iran. Alone without any other political, cultural, economic considerations, that alone for me wants like Brexit to happen in every EU country. But I think that there is a way to still be there without going down that route. And I mean, we talked about that with Poland, that Poland is an exception. And I'm a big supporter of Poland. And I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. The Russians butchered them the last time that they ran roughshod over Poland. So it makes sense why Poland would understand national security in a way that the people elsewhere, more to the West, just don't understand, because to them it's all theoretical. They've always had American protection and everything. They haven't really seen what happens when the enemy comes to your doors. And so that's why they feel like, oh, maybe Iran's the good guys, and maybe there's nothing wrong with China. Maybe we could make some money off of them. Whereas I feel like people in Poland generally recognize, like, oh, these people have like absolutely slaughtered us before with the Soviet communists. We should probably be wary of trading with more communists or trading with more terrorists and stuff. And so I think we're kind of in some area of agreement there, but we can get back to, I guess, what you wanted to talk about, which was the sort of domestic efficacy and whatnot. But you mentioned the Iraq War in your opening statements, and on that, I mean, you also did note that the Iraq War was successful in accomplishing its initial objectives. And I guess I would push back on this by saying, you know, regardless of what popular opinion might be now as stoked by anti-war media, if the mission was accomplished and the objectives were achieved, then at what point could we kind of say, well, you know, it's time to move on. It's time to say that was a good thing, and that we should look to that as an example that we could replicate in the future to take out a security threat. Because I just see a lot of the opinions around the Iraq War as essentially being inculcated by people such as Michael Moore and Bill Maher and Rachel Maddow and Lawrence O'Donnell and Chris Hayes and a lot of these just basically you could characterize as like hippie type people who they don't get it. To them, Saddam Hussein was less bad than George W. Bush. And to me, I just find that crazy, you know, but that's kind of my view.
Oh yeah, there's no question that Saddam Hussein was objectively far worse than George W. Bush. I mean, George W. Bush had bad policies, times that by 100, and you're about 1/5 of Saddam Hussein, maybe. The issue I would push back on is that neoconservatism opens up the point that people in the institutions denounced it, and so it becomes fact. And this is one of the major sort of flaws that are currently existing in America. The institutions are almost always leaning towards the left. It's been like that for a couple of decades now. And there's been some, and up until recently, there's started to be some pushback with that. There's started to be some pushback with apps like Parler and Gab, but they also aren't the best alternatives, but they've also, that's one of the things I would say that paleoconservatives has. It has certainly made them a issue. It has definitely made it come to the attention to conservatives that they don't control the institutions, and that with that they practically don't have much of an existing body. I mean, we can go into all sorts of things on how society is benefiting the Democratic Party and how it could soon be that there won't be a Republican president again, regardless of who takes the helm.
Yeah, I think on the point about institutions, a lot of people have characterized neocons as the establishment in the past, and I always kind of find that funny because the institutions, as you're right to point out, they definitely skew in this very almost, I guess you could characterize as a SJW sort of perspective. I would argue that the American establishment, by and large, tends to favor trade and negotiation and diplomacy over unilateral action. I mean, people kind of talk about John Bolton as if he's establishment or whatever. It's like he's an outsider as far as I'm concerned. But I see the question that you kind of raise here is like, well, how do we kind of how do we have a more fair or level sort of playing field or whatnot from that? I think a part of the institutional issue that's kind of emerged is that you can be a communist. You can literally be the most far left, literal genocide apologist for Pol Pot professor, and you can get tenure and keep a job and have your government salary for the rest of your life. But if you're anybody who's like to the right of center or whatnot, you're going to have a very hard time getting anywhere in academia. I think that in and of itself is part of the problem here, and that's what tends to stoke a lot of this anti-US, anti-Western sort of sentiment, is that it really starts in the schools. But what do you make about that? Like, where would you kind of pinpoint the biggest sort of institutional issue at the moment? Because I would say the problem is namely in academia.
Well, academia and education are certainly up there on the list. I would say the media probably is number one, just because I mean, I'm pretty sure you've seen some of these things the media has done. They've ran articles on the Trump administration that turned out not to be true. And sometimes they wouldn't release a correction until months later. I mean, they tried to run like this. They ran an attack out on Trump that basically when he bragged that he never supported the Iraq war, that he did at one point, even though the only proof was an interview when he said, I guess so. I mean, obviously you probably think that would have been based, but
Oh, absolutely.
but they were trying to control the narrative. Yeah. But they were trying to control the narrative with Trump that he flip-flopped on Iraq when you look at it, he has been fairly consistently against war in Iraq. I mean, I wouldn't argue that's one of that inconsistency is certainly a flaw with Trump in some domestic affairs. He used to support wealth tax, and then in his current administration, he's cutting taxes. Like, yeah, the guy's a flip-flopper, but they're attacking him on the flip-flops that they do that just because they're the ones that matter. Like they're not going to go for him on the tax ones because either way he comes out as a champion, but due to the public opinion on the Iraq war, if they make it look like he flip-flopped on that, it would have been a danger. It would have been like McCain when he flip-flopped on the Iraq war, saying it was a mistake in 2008, even though he also, at least he didn't oppose leaving it, which arguably was a mistake as well. But the media certainly, I mean, it's not even just Trump who's been attacked. Romney has been attacked, ironically, for being too anti-Russian.
Yes, that's what I talk
And
about.
now,
That's one of the things is that's why, like, I despise MSNBC because I see them as like the epitome of Trump derangement syndrome, where for years I watched MSNBC. I would watch Madel, and she would just absolutely critical of Mitt Romney, wouldn't give him credit for anything, any of that sort of stuff. Then the Orange Man becomes president, and now she's basically doing the whole Romney was right thing, and it's like, spare me. She was pro-Russia for the longest time, and now that the Orange Man is weak on Putin, now she wants to be tough on Putin. We all know that if Romney became president and Trump just like went and played golf and didn't go into politics again, she would be anti-war. She'd be calling him a warmonger. So we all know like how MSNBC actually feels. They just want to score cheap points against Trump. I agree with you there. I would say if like any of the sort of like neocons and stuff on social media and whatnot, I would say that I'm probably one of the people that gives Trump the most credit where it's due, I would say. Because like I like Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol's somebody who's consistently always defended the Iraq war. But he doesn't give Trump credit for anything. And I would give Trump credit for Iran and China personally. So I think that, like, you know, you talked about the consistency and whatnot. Would you say that Trump's position on Iran has been fairly consistent? Because it surprised me. I thought he was going to be weaker on Iran personally. I'm glad he was tougher, you know?
well, in 2016, I thought he was going to be, I mean, from what I saw, he always was against the Iran deal. So I knew that was going to be tore up. And of course, the Iran deal was something that definitely benefited Iran, the Iranian state. Now, of course, we don't know how long that's going to last because now we have Biden at the helm.
Yeah.
His CIA director actually drafted the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just, I thought he was going to be fairly consistent on Iran. I didn't think he was actually going to go through with some of the things he did. I didn't think he was going to go and kill Qasem Soleimani, or Salami, however you want to pronounce that name. He's dead now, so as much as I don't like instigating tensions with nations that have the potential to blow us up, I do have to say that could also be a pretty good thing to do with like killing terrorists from those nations who have like thousands of deaths to their name. And of course, the media doesn't care when a terrorist has thousands of deaths to his name because it was bad because Trump did it.
Yeah.
And of course, however, though, I think this thing is that type of foreign policy where we simply kill state-sponsored terrorists instead of just sanctioning them is better responsible. Now, do I support intervention into Iran? No. Do I support necessarily an intervention militaristically into China? No, because I think that would just be a hard-fought war that would be that even if you use nukes would be pretty hard to win just based on the terrain. Now, there are places we can talk about intervention because that could actually save America. I've actually have controversially in the paleoconservative world, suggested that that an intervention into Venezuela would not be a negative aspect because Maduro's a tyrant. He's forcing Venezuelans to move to Colombia. The FARC is being funded by Venezuela. And so these two issues have caused Colombians and Venezuelans to flee to the United States. And I just don't feel comfortable with not turning down people like this, but at the same time, I don't necessarily want a nation with a high number of immigration, not like I'm for moderate immigration as opposed to like millions of people from third world nations that may not be able to fully comprehend American culture. But I mean, it's a weird take, but it's just where I stand on Venezuela, that it needs to probably go away because it's directly affecting us.
Right. Well, no, that's kind of interesting because that can get you canceled as a paleocon if you suggest intervention anywhere. I would push back on the line about Iran that you would say that it makes sense to go after state-sponsored terrorists, but that you wouldn't support intervention against Iran. I see Iran as the source of basically all the terrorism in the Middle East at this point, and they're about to get nukes. So if I was the president of the United States, I would immediately take control of the bulk of their oil fields in the Southwest and conduct aerial campaigns against their nuclear facilities to drive the regime into submission and force a surrender and an expulsion of the regime and a reinstatement of the Shah. That's what I would do personally. And then we'd have the Shah as a Western ally governing Iran, where they wouldn't be a nuclear threat and they would be an ally and a bulwark against China and Russia. That would be my prescription there. But on Venezuela, there's a stronger argument to be made on the, like, legal claims, that kind of stuff, which like I don't buy into, but you could make the argument because the Monroe Doctrine is a thing that's been around for a very long time. And you literally have Venezuela and America's doorstep. Even the people that say Russia gets to take Ukraine because that's their sphere of influence, even those people would have to say, well, then America can take Venezuela, take out Maduro, because that's America's sphere of influence, right? So I think Venezuela is a pretty easy one. It's kind of amazing that anybody opposes taking out Maduro. Maduro, as you mentioned as well, huge source of refugees. And that's the thing. For me, I know I've gotten in trouble and stuff on Twitter with a lot of the people that are more on the left side of things over immigration. I'm not an open borders type person. I'm more of a protectionistic type person on stuff. I think you need to have mostly a points-based system on immigration, but I make an exception in the cases of some asylum seekers. But Venezuela is it's a humanitarian nightmare. They're a staging ground for Russian nuclear bombers. They're a Russian ally. It's like, how could anybody tolerate this? And that's one of the things, is that the Trump administration had taken a tough line rhetorically against Maduro. I'm just disappointed that the Trump administration didn't actually remove Maduro myself. But
well, I do know that during the Venezuela crisis, you actually, I think that was when John Bolton was still there. I mean, if you recall, there was the controversy that he he had on his notepad. He wanted 10,000 American troops into Colombia, which is a nation that Venezuela is sponsoring state terrorism in, and is
Mhm.
actually one of the few nations that actually wants that if America wanted to launch an invasion from Colombia, it almost certainly would give the green light. The sort of, I mean, but then of course the media got hold of it, and then of course suddenly everyone started to complain. You got people like Bernie Sanders trying to say they were trying to reinstate colonialism, despite the fact that Venezuela is the one that's trying to start a union of socialists, and force like conservatives in South America to like suffer purges. The thing, and that I don't think that these restrictions should apply to Venezuela. I think Trump was right to restrict travel to certain Middle Eastern nations. And also, I would actually go further and say that how many people from China have been stealing our technology by coming in. I think that we should limit how many people from China come in. It should just be people of an oppressed minority group, refugees, and Hong Kongers, and Taiwanese, but that's not CCP. But
Right.
those are the three people. Those are the people that probably aren't going to be a security threat, because I doubt any Uyghur, Tibetan, or Mongolian is going to. Most of them coming to America would fight against the Chinese, and of course there'd be people who probably show patriotism and freedom.
Hmm. Oh,
Though,
for sure. For sure. Like I support taking in asylum seekers from Hong Kong, for example, as well as Uyghurs, Tibetans, etc. I mean, they're fleeing communism. It's the same as if you take in refugees from the Soviet Empire and stuff. But I think you're right to note that if you got people coming over here to study and stuff, and then they go back to mainland China after, I mean, at that point, aren't you in a way just teaching the enemy engineering skills and stuff like that? I think that there's a big problem there for sure, right? I mean, and then that goes to the marginal gains thing, which is that, yeah, you can say both sides benefit from trade. One side benefits a lot more proportionally on the margin. That's the Chinese. And we are, by any serious academics read of this, guaranteed to come into conflict with them. So why do we want to strengthen them in the run up to that? We want to get rid of them before it comes to actual war, right? So like that's why I would support protectionist stance on them. I would go so far as to say total cease of any trading relationship and bring all of the heavy industry manufacturing back to Canada, UK, United States, and you can have some stuff made in India and whatnot, as long as it's not like important or essential. That would be my prescription there. I don't think we're going to do it though. I think that basically the establishment that we've got is just too addicted to cheap Chinese products, and that's why we kind of need to have a change in politics here, where we wake up and we have like a Cold War mentality. That's what I would like to see, because right now we're kind of like in the early Cold War, except nobody really realizes that it's happening yet until what? Until the Chinese do something big, I guess. Then we'll be like, oh, we should probably get tough on them now. I'd rather do it before that, but
yeah, I didn't get all that because you were breaking up.
oh, okay, we lost Grayson. Wait, are you guys able to hear me?
I think I'm having internet connection
Yeah,
problems.
no, I
So
think the internet issue is on
I was,
your end.
yeah.
Okay, I can hear you now.
See if I can. Okay, what I was going to say was I didn't get the last part of that, but I guess I did. But I was going to say maybe since this is paleoconservatism versus neoconservatism, I guess now it's time for me to address the skeleton in the closet of paleoconservatism, and that would be the paleoconservatives that did that incident a few days ago. I'm pretty sure you've talked about this, the storming of the Capitol when they committed seditious and treasonous acts by trying to imprison the U.S. Capitol, and like I'm guessing they tried to get them to like sign fake documents to like say Trump is president that wouldn't hold up in courts.
They as well.
Yeah.
They as well. I've got a video for those that are wondering right now because we didn't do a premiere today. The premiere is coming up later on today. I've been pretty busy. I've got a premiere dropping in a couple of hours on what they intended to do to the vice president. That's Mike Pence. They erected about a 15-foot high gallows a few hundred yards from the Capitol building and went into the Capitol chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." They were going to take him hostage or capture him, bring him over the gallows and hang them. That's what they were That's what they were intending to do. So the fact that we both agreed that that was an insurrection, that's more common ground that we've got, because there are some people in the Trump camp right now that are actually trying to defend this. They're actually trying to defend this. They hate Mike Pence now. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, wait, Donald Trump was basically a donor of the Democratic Party just a few years ago. But Mike Pence is this radical leftist in their view. Mike Pence is this socialist or something. It's unbelievably insane to me. And if I were in Mike Pence's shoes at the moment, one, I'm not backing up Trump on anything, but two, I would actually get behind a 25th Amendment procedure at that point. Now, I know John Bolton is against it. I watched John Bolton's reasoning, and his legal advice made sense based on the wording of the 25th Amendment. But we're at a point now where you've got the president egging on an insurrection to go and essentially murder the vice president. If I'm the vice president, there's no way I'm going to be laying that stand. I mean, I know that Mike Pence, he wants to take into account his sort of presidential aspirations and everything down the road. These people should not be courted to anymore. I mean, the protectionist angle, we have to take that for national security reasons. And just because that's popular, that almost doesn't even come into consideration, the popularity of something, because what matters is whether it's good or not for national security. Protectionism is popular and it's good for national security. But in the case of Pence, I think they came there to kill him. I don't think that he should be in any way pandering to them anymore. And I think that the fact that it's insurrectionist is pretty clear. And I expect to see actual Republican senators and Congress people signing on to legislation that's being drafted right now to call upon impeachment proceedings against the president over this. But what's your sort of view on this? Because you said that you were supporting President Trump up until pretty recently. Was it this that kind of changed your mind about it, or was there another sort of incident that got you to say, you know, Trump isn't the brand of republicanism that you support?
Well, it was. I've always had my doubts about Donald Trump, but I've generally been in the supportive group. It wasn't until the election. I mean, coronavirus, that was also another thing, but mostly the election, his refusal to concede, and then of course he kept pushing fraud allegations with no real basis. I mean, sure, Democrats did it too, but let's not go to their standards. I mean, if you want to bitch about election fraud and have people take you seriously, you should just join the Democratic Party at that point. But I've always been against that. I mean, and of course now, so my opinion on him was already kind of on the low and then suddenly I just see the news about them storming the White House. I mean, the Congress building, and his sort of half-assed response, to put it bluntly. I just thought that I don't think that there's any way he might actually commit to a peaceful transfer of power. I mean, I'm a traditionalist, so I do agree that that we established a peaceful transfer of power, so that's what we must commit to. And so that's when I basically decided that the Trump brand needs a definite reforming from mostly because of Trump.
Right. So I guess that kind of gets into, what sort of reform you would like to see. What aspects of the Republican Party under Trump then do you still approve of, and what would you like to see reformed, and what would you suggest going forward? What sort of platform would you like to see in general?
Well, the big era, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, I think Republicans need a health care plan in order to win. That's number one. Number two would be that it needs to end this idea of the I don't know how I would put this, but it needs to like end this idea of a single person being glorified. Like that's the thing. I thought it was definitely a more cult of personality, way more than like the Bidens and the Clintons and the Romneys, and probably not the Obamas, just because that was pretty out there for a while. But I mean, those are the things that need to be reformed. There were good things about Trumpism. There was the protectionist policies against China. There was there were some other domestic policies. There was the strengthening of the border. There was the it was the plan to lower drug prices. That's what I was thinking of. The thing is that those were good policies, but the policy that was considered, it was like the whole, not, I think I'm breaking up actually again. Let's see if I
Well,
think
I can
about
hear
actually
you.
check my why. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
Okay,
can
but I
hear
was
you.
going to say that okay, maybe I should just turn off my camera. Maybe that might actually help.
Well, that'll free up some RAM for
Okay,
sure.
so
Especially if you close out the recording application too, if you're using any sort of external recording application like Logitech or something too.
well, okay, well, I was going to say that the blowing up of healthcare drugs, the strengthening of the border, the protectionism against China, that was a strong pursuit of the Trump administration. Then there was the calling of the $2,000 stimulus, which Mitch McConnell disapproved of. So that's actually one of the reasons I think Loeffler and Trudeau lost the Georgia special elections was because McConnell blocked a popular $2,000 stimulus
Oh,
that both
really?
Ossoff and War.
Oh, wow. Because
That was
I blame the defeat of Loeffler and Purdue on this radical. I would characterize as like hyper paleocon, almost QAnon side of things that thought of them as betrayers to President Trump and didn't show up to vote for them because the votes were so close. I mean, now you can make a case. Well, maybe it's a combination of factors. I just thought the primary reason was that it was Trump voters not coming out to support them.
Well, that was, I mean, I won't disagree with you. That was definitely a big factor. However, though the numbers were smaller, and I think they could have gotten some of the more poor Americans who felt like they needed a stimulus. I mean, it's because there were Warnock and Ossoff supporters that simply voted for them because Mitch McConnell blocked the stimulus, so they figured the only way was to get Mitch McConnell out of the way. Now, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that was probably the biggest reason. I'm saying that was like 60%. But I would say 40% was simply them blocking I mean, not the Trumpers not voting. Of course, that's a case to be made, but also the numbers weren't as large as they make it out to be. I mean, it probably did change some stuff, but I don't know if it. I mean, maybe it would have changed stuff for Trudeau, but probably Loeffler probably still would have lost, which is unfortunate because Raphael Warnock is an
Yeah,
actual
because
insane threat.
Warnock, like the thing with Warnock though is like Warnock's a radical leftist. Warnock is anti-Semitic. He's a democratic socialist, basically. It's like, to me, the Republicans should have had that in the bag, and yet they didn't. And then I see the Lynn Wood crowd, I see the QAnon crowd, I see the crowd of people that supported the insurrectionists. Essentially, I see their types. They thought of Loeffler and Perdue as betrayers of Donald, and I mean, it was a close election. Yes, it's just when you're running against somebody that insane in a red state, or what was up to that point basically a red state in Georgia. I don't know, man. I mean, you can make a point about the stimulus package and everything, but generally speaking, that's a pretty democratic sort of policy. I mean, generally speaking, stimulus packages and whatnot tend to be looked at really skeptically by conservatives in general, because it's like, okay, it's $2,000, but who has to pay for that? Everybody down the road for like the rest of the decades and whatnot, right? It's like it's the sort of thing that it definitely has appeal. The people that it has the most appeal to are the further and further you go on the left, by and large. So it's not really a Republican sort of strong point, or not strong point per se. It's not really something that you do to win over Republicans in general, but.
Yeah, well, I would definitely say you have a point. Again, I'm not saying you're not wrong about the blocking that Lynn Wood and other of those of what I would lump in with the radical idiots of both the far left and the far right. The issue that I would counter with that with is that the suburban areas, which didn't have the high number of Trumpers, that area should have at least been anti-Warnock. You'd think that an anti-Semite would have lost the Jewish community. But, of course, there were a lot of tricks the Democrats pulled. They used a lot of lies. They tried to claim that Loeffler campaigned with a KKK member, when in reality she took one photo with a man she didn't know was a KKK member until after it was revealed. Now, that's still kind of bad, but that's bound to happen in a state like Georgia.
Yeah.
The issue is that they did just these constant lies. They tried to claim that David Trudeau was an anti-Semite because he betrayed John Ossoff as Pinocchio.
Yeah. No, I know. That's the thing, right? It's like it always, like, I mean, both sides accuse each other of anti-Semitism, but if you look into Warnock's statements on Israel and Palestine, yeah, there's a pretty clear-cut case against him that you really can't find with the GOP senators in this case. I mean, it's the sort of thing that It is true. It is true that in general, there is a community of Jewish people in the United States where they're so far left that they'll literally vote for an out-and-out anti-Semite to, I guess, own the Republican. That's true, but that kind of happens in every community. There are people in every community that vote against their own interests because they have like some like fascination or some big focus on a different issue without realizing that like this particular thing matters to them personally. Like I kind of see that with people that are like, that you'll have gay rights supporters, for example, that opposed the war in Afghanistan. And it's like, well, what do you think the Taliban would do with gay people? It's like, what do you mean? How can you be against the war against the Taliban? But I mean, that's an example there. I think the fact that in America, there's like such a large number of people that are Jewish that will vote for people that are far left. That goes to show you how kind of ingrained that sort of culture of almost Republican derangement syndrome, where you never even consider voting for the Republican. But that's true in a lot of communities, though. It's definitely true in a lot of communities. So that's kind of my stance there. I really don't think the stimulus check was that big of a thing. I mean, at the end of the day, that's more of an issue for like Democrats and progressives than it is for Republicans. But
yeah, well, I think one thing that does get a little overlooked in that whole argument was that we still don't question how Georgia turned to the purple state in the first place, and there are many theories to that. However, though, and you can argue that Trump definitely had an effect on Georgia, and that Georgia has also been trending blue for a while now. But one of the big reasons that aren't often talked about is that this is actually happening all over America and has been happening since the 80s. It's that Democrats from large blue states like California and New York have moved to the suburbs because, well, Democrat policies suck, and so they're moving to Republican states. But they bring the policies with them, and so those states are turning blue. I mean, this isn't just some conspiracy theory. This actually
no,
happens.
no,
I don't
you're
think
right.
that the
No, you're right about that. Arizona is a good example. Like Net7 lives in Arizona. He's talked about this. Texas is a good example. That's kind of what Henry's talked about too, that there are people that are sick of the high taxes, high cost of living and everything in these states like California that was imposed by Democratic policies. So they moved, they escaped that stifling economic condition to go to red states where there's economic opportunity. But then they missed the point that they wouldn't have had to leave if they hadn't voted for those things in the first place. And now they bring that policy with them. It's ironic and in some sense tragic in that sense. And I think, if anything, you could have an understanding that you should have some blue states and some red states so that people can pick and choose where they would like to live. But I think on just a moral sort of grounds, if you are going to move towards a different state, you should ask yourself why you're going there. You should ask yourself what it was about the state that you were leaving that made you want to leave. And then you should have some self-awareness to say, I'm not then going to turn my new home into a cluster crap like the place that I left, basically. And unfortunately, that hasn't really happened. No, you're totally right about that. Because, like, look, if I lived in California or if I lived in New York, I'd also get the hell out too, or at least I'd save up to get out, because it's impossible to live there. You can make 6 figures there and it's not enough to survive because you're burdened with taxes. You got a high cost of living. You're surrounded by people who hate your own country. You want to get out. The problem is you can't then make a new California or a new New York in Georgia or Texas. And unfortunately, that's what's been happening. I think that that's a good analysis. And it hasn't been happening in reverse. There weren't people leaving red states for blue states and turning them red, because why would you leave them? They have low cost of living, low taxes. You can retire there. You don't have to be a millionaire to have a decent standard of life. So people don't leave. So it basically puts Republicans at a disadvantage then. And the irony is that the Democratic failures beget their bigger electoral victories in that sense. That's weird, but it's true. So I guess, yeah, I would agree with you on that.
Yeah. I mean, to a certain extent, it's not necessarily the end, because we saw that in 2016 to an extent. A lot of Democrats left states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then they went red because at that point, I guess they were so tired of those policies, they were willing to go for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been something that's happened since the 80s. You saw that with Vermont, which was once the old reliable Vermont, one of the only state to hold out against FDR in 1936. And now, of course, so many Democrats moved there from Vermont that's now practically the state of Bernie Sanders,
Mm-hmm.
which is a kind of a sad reality. The state that opposed FDR is now has a Democratic socialist as their senator. You saw that with Illinois and even California to a degree. And but the main issue is that one state has actually has had a small way to deal with some certain Democrats moving in, the state of Alabama, where a bunch of Democrats are moving into like Huntsville, the suburban area of Alabama, because Huntsville is a nice city and it's in a state with low tax. However, though, the Republicans played a pretty smart move that prevented the state from turning red. They implemented laws that practically prevented big Democrat corporations from California from funding local politicians in Alabama, and that has sort of helped the state remain red.
Interesting. I think, yeah, we've got about half an hour left in the debate or so. We can kind of get back to this sort of approach to what would be a good idea for a platform moving forward. I would suggest, though, that you mentioned how earlier on in the debate you thought that people weren't ready for another war and this and that and whatnot. And it's like I can see that in terms of the current popular stances, which I by and large disagree with, but I acknowledge they exist. The problem is George W. Bush himself did have somewhat of an isolationistic message in the early days of his administration and on the campaign. And then 9/11 happened, and then he got hawk-pilled, and all of his supporters got hawk-pilled and went into Iraq and Afghanistan to basically reaffirm their security standing and to retaliate against the perpetrators of the attacks. The problem is, if you continue a more isolationistic sort of foreign policy, the rest of the world isn't going to forget that America exists just because America forgets that they exist. There's going to be another 9/11, and then you're essentially going to have another hawk come into power. Or if they're not hawkish, the leader will become hawkish as a result of it, like how Bush rose to the occasion. My sort of proposal would be, instead of allowing another 9/11 to happen, just get tough on state sponsors of terror like Iran and get tough on terrorism throughout the Middle East. That would be my sort of approach to it. The problem with the sort of paleo-conservative wing of things is that they basically look at the rest of the world and have this false assumption that if they pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist, the rest of the world will leave America alone. But that's never been the case before. The enemies of America will still be out to destroy America, whether America is on the offensive or on the retreat. But what do you make of that?
That's an interesting point, because American isolation, realistically, America could never really adopt an isolationist policy just to how interconnected we were. I mean, isolationist policies in like the 1920s when we had Harding and Coolidge, that was a time you could use isolationism because like you had the Soviet Union, but there wasn't much of they didn't feel the Soviet Union back then because it was still suffering from famines and being backwards and all that. And there was no Nazi Germany. There was a fascist Italy, but it wasn't really that much of a threat either because it was Italy. And so in the 1920s, there was a case to be made that isolationism is to work. I'm saying that in the 2020s, the new 20s, is that I'm not an isolationist. I'm saying that we should be connected to the world, know our enemies, so that we don't get surprised by them. But I don't think that going through the policies of simply putting troops into a nation isn't necessarily going to work. Like, it's just the terrain of Iran. I mean, you're going to have a situation where you have like Iranian guerrillas, like hiding in the mountains, shooting down millions, like thousands, not millions, but thousands of Americans. And I mean, what's the point when you could just drone strike their nuclear programs, their drone strike program in their country's economy and feel protest in the nations? That would be more effective.
Yeah, to be clear, my policy on Iran is to simply occupy the lowlands in the southwest where almost all of their oil fields are, not even touch the mountains. And that terrain is more similar to Iraq. and then bombard them from the air with strikes on all of their missile and nuclear compounds and their leadership facilities until they eventually surrender. And as part of the terms of the surrender, you de-Ayatollahsize the region and install the Shah as the leader. That's what I would do. I think, yeah, a total war where it's ground presence 100% of Iran, yeah, you would face very high losses. But I don't think you have to do that to stop their nuclear program, because if we don't do anything in the West, and I would hope it would be a coalition. I know it would probably just be the U.S., but I would hope that it would be Canada, the U.K., all freedom-loving nations would participate in this. That if we don't do anything, they're going to get nukes. They're going to nuke U.S. bases in the region. They're going to nuke Israel. And if it's not them doing it, they're going to pass the nukes along to the Houthis or Hezbollah, and they'll do it. And then millions are going to be dead, and then we'll have to do the war anyway. So I'd rather do it before they use nukes. That's my stance.
Yes, that's certainly something I definitely do not want to see the Iranian state with nukes. The effects of a nuclear war would be absolutely devastating to the world. And if Iran got a nuke, it would pretty much be, you could see God knows what affect the United States. Well, not unite, but you could see what would affect two neighboring countries. You could probably see like mass killings of civilians in places. You probably see the nuke in Mecca. You probably see like,
yeah.
And if they're doing like a tradition there, you could see like the deaths of like thousands of just innocent people. So obviously you don't want the Iranians to have nukes. That's why I think that we should be taking out their nuclear scientists. And I don't care what the rest of the world really has to say about that. I don't want to. What will the rest of the world say when they kill thousands of people in the name of Shia Islam in Mecca? What would their sayings be when they bomb some of the oldest cities in the world in the Middle East, or just for some revenge over a state that they lost in the 40s.
Yeah. No, I think the only way to stop them from getting nukes, though, is to end the regime, because sooner or later they will have enough material to put one together. And the best way to do that is to cut off their oil supply. That accounts for the vast majority of their economy. And almost all that oil is in relatively low-lying areas that are easily invadable and occupiable, and then back that up with aerial strikes against their nuclear and missile compounds and their leadership facilities. So that would be my approach there. The Paleocon side of things, though, opposes that intervention, and that's one of those areas where I say, from here to there, from every corner of the world, the neoconservative perspective has been vindicated in that everywhere that the United States and the West has let fester and refused to take action against, we've seen become worse. We've seen North Korea get 100 nukes. We've seen Iran get very close to nukes. We've seen their imperial ambitions expand, where they're in Yemen now, they're in Iraq, they're in Syria, they're in Lebanon. We've seen Russia run roughshod over Europe. To me, I don't see how a paleoconservative future would in any way not result in either an attack that hawkpills people and brings them around to the neocon side, or just the outright withering away of our civilization to our enemies. That's my stance on it. So that's why I say things like foreign policy is the issue of our generation, because if we lose our countries, we're done. Domestic policy doesn't even matter.
Well, I mean, you could definitely say that an attack from like the Taliban did hawkpill people, and that you don't want that attack to happen again. That's pretty fair. And I agree with you on that. I think that's why I think we should do more work to make sure that never happens. The thing I will say in reverse is that we need to be more careful in foreign policy because we've had made mistakes before. I think one of the most obvious ones would be in the 1980s when the U.S. put money into anti-communist militias in Afghanistan, and some of those people turned out to have been terrorists who wanted to bomb the World Trade Center some like
Wait,
15 years later.
wait, Grayson, I gotta stop you there though, because the Mujahideen that was funded in part by the CIA over there, they were fighting the communists. I guess my question for you would be, which was the bigger threat to America? The country with 40,000 nuclear weapons that had the ability to kill half of the US population in several hours and wanted to take over the world, or some guys in the desert with some RPGs? Which is a bigger threat to America and in the 1980s? Like, you would say it was the Soviets, right? That they were a bigger threat, right?
Yeah, well, obviously the Soviet Union was a bigger threat, but my point is that we accidentally created a situation that gave us 9/11. Now, in
No,
their defense, I don't.
it
In their,
wasn't
no, I'm going to.
accidental. It wasn't accidental. I know the guys that helped fund the Mujahideen knew that some of them one day might use their resources to attack America. But they had to deal with the evil empire, because if you had that approach everywhere, you wouldn't give money to the Contras. You wouldn't do anything in Latin America. You wouldn't do anything in Asia. You would be paralyzed by saying, well, any of these guys we work with might one day turn out against us. Therefore, we can't work with anybody. The Soviets would have taken over the world. I mean, I don't even think it was accidental. I think they knew that there might be some blowback. The thing is, we'll deal with that when it comes to it. And if we lose the Soviets, we won't even be alive to have the blowback. So that's why I defend arming the Mujahideen. I mean, even Osama bin Laden, the terrorist, the head of Al Qaeda, even he was a net positive for America in the fight against the communists. He actually did heroic action against the communists, for example. So
Things we should consider about that, though, is that was the funding of the Mujahideen ultimately worth it when you consider the fact that the Soviet Union in the 80s was still on the verge of death? Maybe it would have left.
No, it wasn't. They were on the verge of death as a result of being drawn into Afghanistan and going bankrupt there. One of the reasons why they wound up losing and having to stay so long and be succumb to attrition in Afghanistan was because the United States funded the resistance against them. If there was no support, if there was no support offered to the Mujahideen, the Soviets would have been able to get victory in Afghanistan much, much easier.
But you see, the economics of the Iranian economy, I mean, the Soviet economy was already starting to flatten during the 70s. It was already starting to go down before the war in Afghanistan. I do think it would have ultimately have collapsed. That's the thing with all history. We can't actually know for certain if it would have, but I think it probably would have. I mean, in science,
we can't know for certain. It's just that if imagine you're in the case of U.S. leaders back in the 1980s when this is going on. Are you going to put everything into bringing about their downfall? Because you don't know when they're going to collapse. It could be in 10 years. It could be in 100 years. You might collapse before then. They might bury you. Are you going to put all your resources into doing everything in your power to bring about their downfall? Or are you going to say, well, we could give money to these guys and they are in our interests, but one day down the road after we have victory, some of them might eventually kind of join a different organization that doesn't like us, because the alternative is you give the world, or at least you give Afghanistan and then later future countries over the Soviets. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, I'm giving the resources to the Mujahideen, because you got guys with 40,000 nukes aimed at you in the 1980s. The Mujahideen had 0 nukes, and they were working with you. They weren't even your enemies. So to me, they just seem like allies,
Well, I did say that it was probably likely. Maybe they didn't. I mean, I don't think they expected the Mujahideen to attack 9/11 and kill 3,000 Americans.
But the Mujahideen didn't. That was Al Qaeda. Almost everybody that was Mujahideen never joined Al Qaeda. That was just a fringe offshoot, like 20 years later.
Well, I guess, and I really don't have much of a comment other than it probably. I still do think it was a. It was still necessarily a. It was something that, in hindsight, probably wouldn't have necess that did come back to bite us in the butt. But
No, I
I
know,
won't condemn. I
but
won't condemn
but
them for that action
but
because I know.
3,000 dead 20 years later is better than potentially 150 million dead if the Soviets take over. Like my point there is that you got to do everything in your power to get rid of this country that's got 40,000 nukes aimed at you and wants to take over the world. You can deal with the blowback down the road. I mean, you hope to be lucky enough to survive to see the blowback, because if the Soviets win, they'll bury you. That's the problem, right? Like the Mujahideen was a good force. Al Qaeda that spawned from them down the road, and the Taliban, and the figures that went to join them, they were bad, but they were post-Soviet. They can be dealt with after. The point was to bring down the Soviets first and then deal with stuff later. I don't even think in hindsight it was the wrong thing to do, because if I could go back to then, I also would have supported the Mujahideen, because, what if the Soviets win the Cold War?
Well, we can jump down this rabbit hole of what if of our time. It did bring down the Soviet Union. It did bite us in the butt. But of course, if we go down this what if, we could have just done what if we just defended the Kingdom of Afghanistan from ever falling in the first place? That's just a rabbit hole we go down. Where
No,
Britain
I know.
actually takes.
No, I
So,
know. There were big failures. Like in Iran, for example, the West did basically nothing to protect the Shah. It was embarrassment. And now we got Iran to deal with now. Like you're right, we can go back. I would just say to you, though, that every time we do those thought experiments and go back, the option that would always make the most sense is a neocon option, a hawkish option. The option always would have been have a stronger presence there. So I guess my point now is that in going into the future, are we going to have neocons or paleocons see the future of the Republicans? History's always vindicated the strong foreign policy position. I would argue going forward, if we want to learn our lessons from history, we should have a more proactive presence in the Middle East so that we don't make those same mistakes. We should be defending all of our allies, from Saudi Arabia to Israel, and fighting Iran and the Taliban, etc. And that's the lesson there, is that the lesson is the less resolve, the less you offer to defend your partners, the more you run into situations like they fall, that kind of thing, So I would say that vindicates the neocon side of things even more, actually.
well, I would argue that this was the Cold War too. This was definitely a time when this was definitely the time when military intervention was a lot more justified. I mean, and I would actually, and yeah, I do think I agree with you that we didn't go far enough. We didn't. There were nations that we could have supported that probably would have helped defeat communism faster. We
Mm-hmm.
didn't support Rhodesia. We didn't support the Kingdom of Afghanistan.
Yep.
We didn't support
Well, there were a lot that we like. The Shah under Iran wasn't supported
the
properly.
Shah.
South Vietnam wasn't defended properly. I mean, I would have used nukes. I would use nukes in the Vietnam War, for example, to defend South Vietnam. So,
the Republic of China was another example. We didn't do anything we didn't do anything when Eastern European nations, including my country of Hungary, when we revolted against the Soviets, nothing was done.
That's right. That's right. The West and America just stood back and said, well, the Soviets have a few nukes. We'll just let them get away with this, basically, even though when that happened, at around that point, America had about 15,000 nuclear weapons and the Soviets had less than 1,000. America would have won that so easily. The Soviets didn't even have a way to deliver most of them to American cities. Like the United States could have wiped the Soviets off the map, didn't do it. Like I support Operation Unthinkable, for example. I think if the Soviets had been nuked before they ever got the nuclear bomb, we'd have world peace today. My point here is that every time we do one of these thought experiments where we go back in time, the answer always would have been have a stronger, more hawkish foreign policy. So going forward into the future, The answer is always we should have a stronger and more hawkish foreign policy. That's how you prevent these security crises from getting out of hand. That's my sort of approach. Otherwise, eventually you won't even be a superpower anymore. You'll lose that status if you just neglect your interest in the world. Because your enemies, the Russians, the Chinese, they don't neglect their interests. They do everything to act in their interests. But then we mess up all the time because we have to deal with this anti-war media, the anti-war academic establishment, that at the end of the day, they just undermine our interests. You know, they do that in the UK, they do that in Canada, they do that in the United States, they do that in France even. I mean, it's really unfortunate. They do it in South Korea. They do it in Taiwan too. So to a lesser extent. But
well, I'm not into the idea of becoming isolationist. I've said this multiple times in the stream. I'm for a I have said this before multiple times. I'm not a pigeon, but I just won't consider myself a hawk. I have jokingly said I was a flamingo, but because they're aggressive creatures that don't take crap, but if you don't mess with them, they won't come after you. That's the thing. I think America should not take any threat lightly and should respond with any appropriate needs to a threat. But we shouldn't just we should be more careful and more reserved when we do make decisions like this, or lest we fall to a jingoish policy.
well, John Bolton, you know, he would argue the counter. He would say, why always be on the defensive and permanently forever having to react to attacks? Why not kill them over there before they kill you over here? That's what he would say. And I would agree with that. Like, I'm an offensive realist in that sense. You know, I think it's better to do stuff on their land than to wait for them to come over to ours.
I think we should be able to detect, like, if we are able to detect the threat in a nation, I think that's what we should start telling our men to do, like focus on. That's like, hey, we just realized that Iran is building weapons of mass destruction. We don't know where they're going to aim them for. Let's make sure they can't do that. That's what we should do. I'm not saying like if we got to do any if we went for any threat though if we had a jingoish foreign policy, we would have said, hey, Saudi Arabia has men who partook in 9/11. That must mean we can't trust them. That was jingoism.
Those people were not with the Saudi government. They were exiles. They were like Bin Laden was in exile, right?
I know they weren't.
They were at war. Al Qaeda hates Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has consistently been at war with Al Qaeda, right?
Oh yeah, I know that, but I know that it's not. I'm not saying they would. I'm saying that they were just Saudi citizens that were born in Saudi Arabia, and so jingoists would argue that you need to invade Saudi Arabia. That jingoism is just.
We have ISIS guys that came from Canada and the United States too. That doesn't mean that Canada and the US are ISIS, right? Those people, they're dumb. Like I'm a neocon in that sense. I'm not like a jingoist about anything. But.
Yeah. I'm not. Most realistic neocons aren't. If you have most neocons with, like, even if you have the slightest bit of realism, you're not a jingoist because jingoists act in irrational matters.
Right.
Obvious. I mean, you could even argue that paleocons could be jingoist too, but the alt-right is like paleocon jingoism, because I will argue that Nick Fentress is not going to save America. He is a cuck who literally admitted he would live under socialism.
Yes. Okay, so that's an area of agreement. His Groypers got so outraged at me for pointing out when I did a video on him that was just looking at a clip where he said, give me full communism over what we're doing now. Give me full Stalinism over what we're doing now. And he was referring to American politics in like the last 40, 50 years. He admitted right there that all he cares about is basically more white babies or whatever, even though he's not really white. And in that sense, he'd rather have communism for more white babies. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, wait, isn't the whole argument about having more kids supposed to be we want more babies so that we can have a stronger nation and a bigger military and all that? If you're already surrendering to the communists, why would you want a stronger nation? At that point, you're just a bigger slave to the communist system. Like, at that point, defending your country doesn't mean anything because your country's already fallen to communism. He is a blatant racist who doesn't care about any actual American values. And you're right, like, his version of saving America is selling out America to communism as long as he gets his little ethno state. Like, he's a Nazbol, basically.
Ethno state isn't. That's not. I would argue that an ethno state is not in the interest of America. Now, I don't argue for the radical multiculturalism. That multiculturalism is a strength. I just don't think that you should go one way either way. I think that we can have other cultures, but we should have like the melting pot theory, not like what you have in Canada, where with like the Quebecers and English.
No, I agree. I'm a big critic of Canadian multiculturalism. I think it's been a clear failure. I'm a moral universalist. I don't think all cultures are equal. I think some cultures are disgusting and need to be rid from the world, and others need to be exported and promoted throughout the world. I think that that's one of the reasons why my foreign policy is as it is, because I'm not one of those people who says, well, the North Koreans, the Iraqis, they have their own dictator system and we have a democracy and I can't tell which is better. It's like, no, one is better than the other and should be exported throughout the world. The other is clearly inferior and needs to be wiped off the face of the earth. That's my standpoint. I'm an anti-multiculturalist for sure. That doesn't mean that I think that there's only one culture that can work. It's just some cultures can coexist with each other. Other cultures, there's no point in even trying to coexist with, because they either seek your destruction or they're so reprehensible that merely coexisting with them is an endorsement of the devil, basically, as I see it. And so that's kind of my stance there. But we are coming up on the hour and a half mark. So I think we should go to closing statements. But before we do that, if you had any other sort of remarks on this portion of the debate before we go to closing statements, feel free.
I would just say one more thing that's sort of in the ironic sense that when the Venezuela situation started, Nick Fuentes literally said that it was American imperialism, which just happens to copy the BLM narrative that was American imperialism. And so that seems to be the one thing they seem to agree with is that socialism is better than the status quo, even though one's supposedly supposed to be right-wing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. We'll go to closing remarks, though. So I'll start. I don't really think I have like 3 minutes. I think I've only got a couple minutes here that I actually want to use. So I was just going to say, I think it's clear that when we have these sort of discussions and whatnot, it was an interesting opportunity to take a look at a more somewhat paleo-conservative side of things coming from Grayson and contrasting that with what I've described as like a liberal brand of neoconservatism. I think that when at the end of the day, when we look at the future of our civilization going forward, what I try to do in terms of my work with the hawk pill and whatnot is to wake people up so that we aren't forced to respond to things on an ad hoc basis as they emerge, such as in the case of 9/11, that I would rather have a proactive basis where instead of waiting for the North Koreans to use nukes, we take them out before they even get the means to do so. Likewise with Iran, likewise with their proxies, and likewise on an economic level with Russia and China. I think that throughout history, throughout modern history, it's been the case that in any particular example throughout history where there are mistakes, where things went bad and then wars emerged as a result, the case would have been to have a stronger foreign policy in the initial stage to prevent greater destruction in the long run. I think it's been clear that whenever America and the Western world at large has taken a more insular or liberal internationalist approach in terms of conducting diplomacy and negotiations with our enemies, things always brew and fester and get out of hand until things get so bad that we're attacked. And then even those that were anti-war, now sing the praises of the military, and now all of a sudden come out and say, oh, we have to respond for 9/11 and everything. Whereas if you had a really proactive approach in the early days before that, you could have prevented something like that from emerging. I think that by and large, the future cannot be an insular approach. It can't be this idea of, well, we have domestic problems, therefore we should neglect our foreign problems, because the domestic battles will always exist. The question is, will you have your own country, or will you be a colony of an enemy? And if we just let Russia, North Korea, and Iran and China just get to do their thing, and we're always just responding in this tit-for-tat ad hoc basis when, say, an attack like 9/11 happens, or say something like they shoot down a drone happens, and then we respond proportionately, we're forever going to be locked in this eternal reactive defensive mode until the point where they have enough force that they can do a first strike to wipe us out immediately, and then it'll be over. I don't want to see that happen. I want Western supremacy on the world stage, vast supremacy. And I think that a neocon renaissance would be the best way to do that, because then you can have a country into the future that you can have a debate over domestic issues and whatnot. Whereas if we take an insular direction, we won't even have our own countries anymore. China will take over Canada, the United States, either directly or just through moneyed interests and whatnot, and that's a huge problem. But that's my closing statements there. So thanks for coming on and doing the debate. I thought it was interesting. We'll go to Grayson now for his closing remarks.
I will say that I don't necessarily, that though I'm a paleocon, I won't consider myself a what you call the normal paleocon. I would say moderate paleocon, and it probably showed tonight. And I'm probably going to start getting some direct messages from FinToys fanboys saying that I'm some sort of loony socialist, even though he's the one who's socialist, but that's beside the point. But other than that, I think that ultimately this stream has shown one thing, that paleocons and neocons can actually get along with issues, we can find common ground, and that having a party that's necessary, that can have both, won't necessarily means we have excluded interests. We both need to have a love for America, and we need to be willing to do what's necessary to save it. That's what both of us typically agree to. At the end of the day, we want to save the country we love. We want to defeat socialist threats. We want to defeat Islamic threats. We want to defend the traditional values of America. And we as conservatives need to fight together. We live in what you have so elegantly coined the era of cringe. And I think that when we're in this era, we need to have the common allies come together, even if we don't necessarily see eye to eye on everything. Paleocons and neocons see eye to eye more together than a paleocon and a social democrat, or a neocon and a, I guess, neoliberal.
Yeah. No, for sure. For sure. Absolutely. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess since I'm here, fuck Richard Spencer, too.
Ah, there you go. Yeah, fuck Richard Spencer. There we go. Base. So we had some agreement there. I think it was a pretty good discussion by and large. We are going to be wrapping it up now. But before we do that, I'll say, as I've said to everybody, that's part of the deal here. You come on and debate me, you get to mirror this on your channel or your channels whenever you want. So Grayson, if you got a channel, you can mirror this over there. You've got the rights to do so and everything. They have to occur on my channel so that I get to protect the copyright, so that I can give that right to you to basically mirror it over there. Of course, I did a debate with somebody. He filed a copyright against me, even though we had agreed that I could mirror it. That's why everything has to be on this show. But if you want to debate me and you want to challenge me and you're out there and everything, the process by which you do that, like what Grayson did and everybody else that's come on, you DM me over on Twitter and we set up a time and a day to do a debate. And I'll debate anybody at this point. The only conditions are I only debate those that challenge me. All debates have to take place on this show, but you have the right to mirror it because there's no sort of home advantage or anything here. It's supposed to be pretty neutral. And most of the time, I don't really read the chat or anything. Just focus on the debate. And like I said, like literally, I debated a Nazbol recently. I'll debate a communist. Doesn't matter. I want to get outside of this narrative that like all neocons can't really debate. They can just write policy papers and stuff. It's like BS. I can debate anybody. With that, everybody knows where to find me and stuff. But where can they find you, Grayson? And do you have a YouTube channel?
Well, I do have a YouTube account, a pretty inactive one. It's Hungry Country Ball. I don't do much on it anymore, and I have a Twitter account. You can follow me at H Country Ball. And it's a good thing you're not probably reading the chat, Kevin, because that is a dumpster fire.
I kind of glanced at it tonight. It didn't seem that bad. I was told during the Nazbol one that it was just a bunch of communists calling me like a Jew and stuff. So.
Oh God. Yep. And when are they not accusing you of being a Jew? Or
no, man.
Anti-Semite?
That's the thing. Well, I mean, they were communists, but they were also like Nazbol types, basically, like Nazbols. So they hate Jews and stuff. But some of them were like calling me like a Trotskyite and stuff. It's kind of funny, even though I supported the killing of Trotsky. Kind of funny on that. But yeah. But yeah, like I'll debate tankies. I'll debate anarchists. I'll debate anybody. And hell, I've said this before. Even if you're a friend of mine and we disagree on stuff, you can come on and debate me too. We're trying to do a lot of debates this year. And I think it's actually a good opportunity. I mean, that's one of the things that you talked about, Grayson, was like how, yeah, paleocons and neocons can actually kind of get along and stuff. It really depends how paleocon people are. Like if it's Richard Spencer or something who you could say is almost more of a socialist at this point, there's no area to work together or anything. I mean, he doesn't have the same kind of common goal. But if you are like a paleocon type person, your goal actually is to defend the West and everything, and there might be some economic areas that we could actually compromise on there. Because I'll say this. One of the areas that I found myself in agreement with paleocons on recently was the failure of the neoliberal establishment on trading with China. And in that sense, that there's definitely some areas of common ground on trade that we could definitely have down the road. But with that, another thing I'll say is like, you're welcome to come on and debate on a different topic down the road too. It's always interesting. So, but we will be wrapping this up now. I'm going to have a short sort of post-debate stream where I kind of go over what I thought about my performance and stuff. But with that, thank you for watching, everybody, and have a good night.
Also, join the Patreon gang, like I did.
See, that's the other thing that's great, is that Grayson here, even though we're debating tonight, he's actually a patron of this channel. So like that's another thing about how, yeah, we're kind of a diverse group of different perspectives. We're all just, the thing that unites us all is that we're pro-West at the end of the day. And we're anti-Venezuela under Maduro, and we're anti-communist China. So there is a lot of area of common ground that we can work together, even if we disagree on certain stuff. So there you go. I mean, and that's another thing. Is like I'll debate patrons too. If the patron gang has an issue with, you know, or a disagreement on specific areas and stuff. So I think people enjoyed the debate. Some people, I think Kanzik said he thought that this was more of a discussion than a debate. But you know, nobody really knows that going in. So because we arranged it as a debate and everything. But I thought it was a good opportunity. I thought it was a good discussion. So
that was too.
Yeah, well, there you go. And thanks for your support, by the way, to the channel and everything. And
thanks for good content.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I think when all those gripers, the Nick Fuentes guys, came and preemptively disliked my video before it even dropped, some of them clicked the Patreon link, and they're fuming that there's this guy out there that disagrees with Nick Fuentes that has this organic support, because they're, at the end of the day, they're just anti-Western. They're not interested in the West. They basically they're cool with communism as long as they get their little ethno state, and we don't really have anything in common with those people. I think that the best way to trigger those people is honestly, it's the patron gang. It grinds their gears, man. You know, because like Nick Fuentes is somebody that like, yeah, he'll have his like rabid little gang of like lunatics and stuff, but they know that that the future is definitively not communist apologetic, and it really angers them. It really angers them, and so I think that's about everything that I've got. But if you got any sort of closing remarks, feel free, and then we'll wrap this up.
Well, I think this is like my third closing remark, so I'll just keep this one short. West is best. To hell with Iran.
Based. Okay. Have a good night, everybody. Peace.